The mahogany-paneled courtroom erupts in barely contained laughter as the young woman on the witness stand claims she single-handedly held off an entire Taliban unit for 6 hours while protecting wounded civilians in Afghanistan. Your Honor, the defense attorney smirks. My client apparently thinks she's some kind of one-woman army. Perhaps we should check if she's confusing reality with a Hollywood movie. Even the judge struggles to maintain his composure as the woman in the simple gray dress continues her impossible testimony with unwavering conviction. But what none of them know is that in exactly 48 hours, this same courtroom will witness something that will transform their mockery into stunned silence and their disbelief into the deepest respect. From which corner of the world are you watching this extraordinary moment unfold? If stories where truth conquers ridicule inspire you, hit subscribe for more moments where heroes are revealed in the most unexpected ways. The federal courthouse in downtown Denver had witnessed thousands of civil proceedings over its 90-year history, but few cases had generated as much local media attention as the lawsuit between former Army medic Rachel Martinez and Blackstone Security Corporation. The case centered around allegations of wrongful termination, discrimination, and the systematic silencing of a whistleblower whose claims about corporate military contracts had initially been dismissed as the desperate fabrications of a disgruntled employee. On this gray October morning, as autumn light filtered through the courthouse's tall windows, Rachel sat at the plaintiff's table with the quiet composure of someone who had learned to remain calm under the most extreme pressure. Rachel Martinez was 29 years old, though the events of the past 3 years had etched lines of experience around her dark eyes that made her appear older. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a modest gray dress that suggested someone of limited financial means, a far cry from the expensive suits worn by the corporate defense team assembled across the courtroom. Around her neck hung a small silver cross that she touched occasionally when the testimony became particularly difficult, and on her left wrist was a simple black watch that seemed somehow significant beyond its modest appearance. The defense team representing Blackstone Security was led by Harrison Pierce, one of Denver's most prominent corporate attorneys, whose reputation for aggressive cross-examination and character assassination had made him the go-to lawyer for companies facing employee whistleblower claims. Pierce was a tall, imposing man in his 50s whose silver hair and custom-tailored suits projected the kind of authority that intimidated opposing witnesses and impressed juries. His strategy in this case was straightforward. Portray Rachel as an unstable former employee whose wild claims about heroic military service were designed to generate sympathy and mask her poor job performance. Judge William Thornton presided over the proceedings with the weary authority of someone who had seen countless civil disputes and grown skeptical of dramatic claims made by either side. At 62, Thornton had been on the federal bench for 15 years, long enough to develop a reputation for no-nonsense courtroom management and impatience with what he considered theatrical attempts to influence jury sympathy. His expression as he listened to Rachel's testimony suggested a man who found her claims about military heroism to be precisely the kind of emotional manipulation he had learned to distrust. The jury consisted of 12 citizens whose backgrounds represented a cross-section of Colorado society: a retired teacher, a small business owner, 2 construction workers, a nurse, an accountant, a homemaker, and several others whose life experiences had given them varying degrees of familiarity with military service. As Rachel's testimony progressed, their expressions ranged from polite skepticism to poorly concealed amusement, particularly when she began describing events in Afghanistan that seemed to belong more in an action movie than in real life. Rachel's attorney, David Kim, was a young civil rights lawyer who had taken her case on contingency because he believed her claims about corporate retaliation and discrimination. Kim lacked the resources and experience to match Pierce's aggressive tactics, but he had been impressed by Rachel's consistent and detailed account of events that had led to her termination from Blackstone Security. As Rachel testified, Kim watched the jury's skeptical reactions with growing concern, realizing that his client's credibility was being undermined by the very heroism he had hoped would generate sympathy. Miss Martinez, Pierce began his cross-examination with the theatrical confidence of a predator approaching wounded prey. You claim that on September 15, 2019, in Afghanistan's Kunar province, you single-handedly fought off an entire Taliban unit while providing medical care to wounded civilians. Is that your testimony? Rachel's voice remained steady despite the hostile tone. Yes, sir. That's what happened. Pierce turned to face the jury with an expression of theatrical disbelief. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Martinez would have us believe that she, a single army medic weighing perhaps 130 pounds, held off dozens of heavily armed Taliban fighters for 6 hours while simultaneously treating wounded civilians in a remote village. Does this sound credible to you? Several jury members exchanged glances that suggested they shared Pierce's skepticism. The retired teacher shook her head slightly, while one of the construction workers rolled his eyes at what appeared to be obvious fabrication. Mr. Pierce, Judge Thornton interrupted, please direct your questions to the witness rather than editorializing for the jury. Pierce nodded with mock contrition before turning back to Rachel. Miss Martinez, how many Taliban fighters were involved in this alleged engagement? Approximately 40 to 50 fighters, sir, organized in multiple assault teams. The courtroom erupted in poorly suppressed laughter. Several jury members smiled openly, while spectators in the gallery whispered to each other about the absurdity of Rachel's claims. Even Judge Thornton's mouth twitched with what might have been amusement. 40 to 50 fighters, Pierce repeated with exaggerated emphasis. And you held them off by yourself? I wasn't by myself, sir. I was protecting 12 wounded civilians who couldn't be evacuated due to enemy fire. They helped as much as they were able. I see. So you and 12 wounded civilians defeated 40 to 50 Taliban fighters. With what weapons? Rachel's composure never wavered despite the mockery in Pierce's voice. I had my M4 rifle, approximately 300 rounds of ammunition, and the tactical training I received during my military service. Pierce walked closer to the witness stand, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Miss Martinez, have you ever seen a war movie? Because your testimony sounds remarkably similar to Hollywood's version of military heroism. David Kim stood to object, but Pierce continued before the judge could rule. Let me ask you this. Did you personally kill or wound any of these alleged Taliban fighters? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rachel's hand moved unconsciously to the silver cross at her throat before she answered. Yes, sir. 17 confirmed enemy casualties during the engagement. The laughter in the courtroom was no longer suppressed. Several jury members shook their heads in obvious disbelief, while Pierce's expression suggested he had just proven his point about Rachel's delusional claims. 17 confirmed kills, Pierce announced to the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Martinez apparently believes she's Rambo. Judge Thornton gavelled for order, but his tone suggested he was more amused than annoyed by the disruption. Mr. Pierce, please maintain courtroom decorum. Miss Martinez, please continue your testimony. Rachel's voice remained calm and factual as she described the 6-hour firefight in detail. The initial ambush that had wounded the civilians she was treating, her decision to remain in the village rather than attempt evacuation, the systematic defense of her position using tactical principles she had learned during advanced combat training. Her account included specific details about ammunition management, enemy movement patterns, and medical procedures performed under fire that demonstrated either extensive military knowledge or remarkably creative fabrication. Miss Martinez, Pierce continued, you claim this heroic action earned you military commendations. What awards did you allegedly receive? The Silver Star, the Bronze Star with V device, the Purple Heart, and the Combat Medical Badge, sir. Pierce turned to the jury with an expression that suggested Rachel had just claimed to be Superman. The Silver Star is one of the military's highest awards for valor. You expect this jury to believe that an Army medic received such recognition for a firefight that, according to you, involved impossible odds and Hollywood-level heroics. I expect the jury to consider the evidence and testimony presented to them, sir. Pierce's cross-examination continued for 2 more hours, with each question designed to highlight the apparent impossibility of Rachel's claims. He focused particularly on the physical demands of her described actions, the tactical improbability of her success against overwhelming odds, and the suspicious similarity between her account and popular military fiction. Throughout this ordeal, Rachel maintained the same calm professionalism that had characterized her testimony. She answered each hostile question with factual precision, providing additional details when pressed, and never becoming defensive or emotional despite the obvious mockery from the courtroom audience. When Pierce finally concluded his cross-examination, the damage to Rachel's credibility appeared complete. Jury members looked at her with expressions ranging from pity to annoyance, clearly believing they had listened to an elaborate fabrication designed to generate sympathy for what was essentially an employment dispute. David Kim attempted to rehabilitate his client during redirect examination, but the skeptical atmosphere in the courtroom made every question feel like an uphill battle. When he asked Rachel why she had never mentioned these military commendations during her employment with Blackstone Security, her answer only seemed to deepen the jury's skepticism. "I don't discuss my military service unless directly relevant to my job performance," Rachel explained. "My role at Blackstone was as a medical consultant, and my employers were aware of my Army medic background. The specific details of my combat experience weren't relevant to contract negotiations or medical training programs." Pierce's objection interrupted her explanation. "Your Honor, Miss Martinez is now claiming she deliberately concealed information about her alleged heroic military service. This supports our contention that she has created this entire narrative to support her wrongful termination claim." Judge Thornton sustained the objection, and Kim was forced to move on without fully explaining Rachel's reasons for maintaining privacy about her military decorations. As the first day of testimony concluded, local news reporters gathered outside the courthouse to interview spectators and legal experts about the day's proceedings. The general consensus was that Rachel's claims were so outlandish that they undermined any legitimate complaints she might have about her treatment by Blackstone Security. "It's clear that Miss Martinez is desperate to generate sympathy for her case," commented legal analyst Jennifer Walsh during the evening news broadcast. "But claiming to be some kind of war hero with impossible military achievements is more likely to backfire than help her cause." That evening, Rachel sat in her modest apartment reviewing her testimony and preparing for the next day's proceedings. Her living room was simply furnished, with few personal items beyond military family photos and a small shelf of medical textbooks. Notably absent were any visible military awards or commendations, a detail that Pierce would undoubtedly use to further undermine her credibility. Her phone rang with a call from David Kim, who sounded discouraged by the day's events. "Rachel, I have to ask, is there any documentation of these military awards you claim to have received? Because the jury clearly doesn't believe your testimony, and without proof, we're going to lose this case." Rachel's response was quiet but firm. "David, everything I testified about is true. I understand that the circumstances sound impossible, but that doesn't change what happened. But where are the medals? Where are the military records that would support your claims?" Pierce is going to argue tomorrow that your inability to produce documentation proves you've fabricated this entire story. "The documentation exists," Rachel said carefully, "but accessing it requires security clearances and authorization levels that aren't available for civil litigation." Kim's frustration was evident. "Rachel, that sounds like exactly the kind of excuse someone would make if they were lying. You're asking the jury to believe an incredible story based solely on your word, with no supporting evidence." After hanging up, Rachel opened a small safe in her bedroom closet and removed a manila folder containing documents that could have ended the day's mockery instantly. Military orders, medical records, casualty reports, and witness statements that validated every detail of her testimony. But the folder also contained classification markings that prevented her from introducing the materials as evidence without authorization from the Department of Defense. She had requested that authorization 6 months earlier when the lawsuit was filed. The request had been forwarded through multiple levels of military and civilian authority, but no response had been received. Rachel was caught between her obligation to maintain classified information security and her need to defend herself against character assassination in civilian court. The second day of trial began with Blackstone's presentation of their defense case. Pierce called witnesses who testified about Rachel's job performance, her alleged difficulties working with colleagues, and her supposed tendency to exaggerate her qualifications and experience. The portrait that emerged was of an unstable employee who had been appropriately terminated for performance issues and was now seeking revenge through fabricated claims of discrimination and military heroism. Dr. Marcus Webb, Blackstone's corporate psychiatrist, testified about the psychological profile of employees who create elaborate fantasy narratives to explain their professional failures. His testimony was clearly designed to suggest that Rachel's military claims were manifestations of psychological instability rather than actual experiences. Individuals who feel powerless in their civilian lives sometimes create heroic military personas to compensate for feelings of inadequacy, Webb explained to the jury. These fantasies can become so elaborate and detailed that the individual begins to believe them completely. Pierce nodded approvingly. Doctor, in your professional opinion, is Miss Martinez's testimony about single-handedly fighting off dozens of enemy fighters consistent with factual reporting or psychological fantasy? Based on the physical and tactical impossibilities described in her testimony, I would classify her account as elaborate fantasy designed to generate sympathy and deflect attention from legitimate performance issues. David Kim's cross-examination of Webb focused on the doctor's lack of direct interaction with Rachel and his unfamiliarity with actual military combat experiences, but the damage to Rachel's credibility continued to accumulate. As the defense case concluded, Judge Thornton announced that closing arguments would begin the following morning, after which the jury would begin deliberations. The general expectation among court observers was that the jury would quickly find in favor of Blackstone Security, viewing Rachel's lawsuit as the desperate action of a disturbed former employee. That evening, Rachel received a phone call that would change everything about the next day's proceedings. The caller identified himself as Colonel James Harrison from the Department of Defense Public Affairs Office, and his message was brief but significant. Miss Martinez, we've reviewed your request for declassification of certain military records related to your civil litigation. Due to recent policy changes regarding veteran support and the public interest in your case, limited declassification has been authorized effective immediately. Rachel felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Sir, what specific materials have been cleared for release? Enough to verify the essential facts of your military service and the incident in Khyber Province. A military representative will be present in court tomorrow to authenticate the documents and provide additional testimony if required. The third day of trial began with an unexpected announcement from Judge Thornton. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, before we proceed with closing arguments, the court has been informed that additional evidence has become available that may be relevant to this case. We will hear this evidence before concluding the proceedings. David Kim stood to address the court, his expression showing hope for the first time since the trial began. Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Colonel James Harrison, United States Army, to present testimony relevant to Miss Martinez's military service record. The courtroom doors opened to admit a full colonel in Army dress blues, his uniform bearing the ribbons and insignia of a career military officer with extensive combat experience. Colonel Harrison walked to the witness stand with the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere in the courtroom. Colonel Harrison, Kim began after the witness was sworn in. Please identify yourself for the record. Colonel James Harrison, United States Army, currently assigned to the Department of Defense Public Affairs Office with responsibility for military personnel records and veteran affairs. Are you familiar with the military service record of Miss Rachel Martinez? Yes, sir. I have reviewed her complete military file, including classified operational reports from her deployment to Afghanistan. Pierce stood quickly to object. Your Honor, this witness and his testimony were not disclosed during discovery. The defense objects to surprise witnesses and unproduced evidence. Judge Thornton considered the objection carefully. Mr. Kim, please explain the late appearance of this witness. Your Honor, Colonel Harrison's testimony involves classified military information that required special authorization from the Department of Defense. That authorization was only received yesterday evening. The judge's expression showed he understood the implications. Colonel Harrison, do you have documentation authorizing the release of classified information for these proceedings? Harrison presented a folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Thornton. After reviewing the authorization documents, the judge nodded approvingly. The witness may proceed. Kim continued his examination with growing confidence. Colonel Harrison, can you verify Miss Martinez's military service record and any commendations she received during her deployment to Afghanistan? Yes, sir. Specialist Martinez served with distinction as a combat medic with the 10th Mountain Division during Operation Enduring Freedom. Her service record includes the following decorations: Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry in action, Bronze Star Medal with V device for valor, Purple Heart for wounds received in action, and the Combat Medical Badge. The courtroom, which had been filled with skeptical murmurs just moments before, fell into complete silence. Harrison's calm, authoritative presentation of information that exactly matched Rachel's earlier testimony began to shift the atmosphere from mockery to attention. "Colonel, can you describe the specific action for which Specialist Martinez received the Silver Star?" Harrison opened a classified folder and began reading from an official military report. On September 15, 2019, in Kunar Province, Afghanistan, Specialist Martinez was providing medical support to a civilian medical outreach program when the village came under coordinated attack by approximately 45 Taliban fighters. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Specialist Martinez established a defensive position and engaged enemy forces while simultaneously treating 12 wounded civilians who could not be evacuated due to intense enemy fire. The jury members who had been laughing at Rachel's testimony less than 24 hours earlier now listened with rapt attention as Colonel Harrison continued his account. For 6 hours, Specialist Martinez maintained her defensive position against repeated enemy assaults, using superior marksmanship and tactical positioning to prevent enemy forces from overrunning her location. Her actions resulted in 17 confirmed enemy casualties and prevented the capture or execution of the civilians under her protection. Pierce stood to object, but Harrison continued before the objection could be voiced. When relief forces arrived, they found Specialist Martinez still treating wounded civilians while maintaining security of her position. Her ammunition was nearly exhausted. She had sustained shrapnel wounds to her left arm and shoulder, but she had successfully protected every civilian under her care. The courtroom was now completely silent except for Harrison's authoritative voice. Rachel's testimony, which had been dismissed as fantasy just hours earlier, was being validated in precise detail by a senior military officer. Reading from official combat reports, Judge Thornton leaned forward with obvious interest. "Colonel Harrison, these are significant military decorations. Can you explain why this information wasn't available earlier in these proceedings?" "Your Honor, Specialist Martinez's actions occurred during a classified operation involving sensitive intelligence activities. The details of her service were classified to protect operational security and ongoing military activities in the region." Harrison presented additional documentation to the court. These records have been declassified specifically for these proceedings to ensure that Ms. Martinez receives appropriate recognition for her service and to correct any misunderstandings about her military record. Pierce attempted to challenge the authenticity of the military records, but Harrison's credentials and the official nature of his testimony made such challenges appear desperate rather than legitimate. As Harrison's testimony concluded, the transformation in the courtroom was remarkable. Jury members who had been rolling their eyes at Rachel's claims now looked at her with expressions of respect and awe. The retired teacher who had shaken her head in disbelief was now taking detailed notes about Harrison's testimony. Kim's redirect examination focused on the significance of Rachel's military awards and the rarity of such decorations being awarded to enlisted personnel, particularly combat medics. Harrison's explanation of the rigorous process required for Silver Star approval further reinforced the authenticity and significance of Rachel's service. When Harrison stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom remained silent for several moments as everyone absorbed the complete reversal of their understanding about Rachel's credibility and character. Pierce's closing argument, which he had planned to focus on Rachel's alleged psychological instability and fabricated military claims, was hastily revised to address the new reality of authenticated military heroism. His attempts to minimize the significance of her service or suggest that military valor didn't relate to employment discrimination claims fell flat, with a jury that now understood they had witnessed something extraordinary. David Kim's closing argument was transformed by the authentication of Rachel's military service. Rather than defending his client against charges of fabrication, he was able to focus on how Blackstone Security had discriminated against and ultimately terminated a decorated war hero whose only crime had been reporting safety violations and questioning corporate practices. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Kim concluded, Ms. Martinez risked her life to protect civilians in Afghanistan, and she risked her career to protect American military personnel by reporting safety violations in corporate training programs. In both cases, she chose duty and integrity over personal safety and convenience. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a unanimous verdict in favor of Rachel Martinez, including substantial damages for wrongful termination, emotional distress, and punitive sanctions against Blackstone Security for their treatment of a decorated veteran. As the verdict was read, Rachel maintained the same composed dignity that had characterized her testimony throughout the trial. When reporters approached her outside the courthouse, her comments were brief and focused on the broader issues of veteran support and corporate accountability rather than personal vindication. This case was never about me, she told the assembled media. It was about ensuring that military contractors maintain the highest standards of safety and integrity when working with our service members overseas. But the story didn't end with the jury verdict. 3 days after the trial concluded, Rachel received another call from Colonel Harrison with news that would provide the ultimate validation of her service and character. Ms. Martinez, Harrison said, due to the public attention generated by your court case and the declassification of your military records, the Department of Defense has recommended you for additional recognition. The President would like to present your Silver Star in a formal White House ceremony. The ceremony took place 2 weeks later in the East Room of the White House, attended by military officials, congressional representatives, and members of the media who had initially covered Rachel's impossible testimony with skepticism. President Williams spoke about the sacrifice and service of America's military heroes, particularly those whose actions in classified operations couldn't be immediately recognized. Specialist Martinez represents the best of American military service, the president said. Her courage under fire saved the lives of innocent civilians, and her integrity in civilian life has helped ensure the safety of our military personnel around the world. When the president pinned the Silver Star on Rachel's uniform, the same reporters who had mocked her testimony less than a month earlier now covered the ceremony with the respect appropriate for recognizing genuine American heroism. In the months that followed the White House ceremony, Rachel used her newfound public platform to advocate for veteran employment rights, corporate accountability in military contracting, and improved support for service members transitioning to civilian careers. Her experience with having her military service questioned and dismissed had given her unique insights into the challenges faced by veterans whose service couldn't be easily documented or understood. She accepted a position with a veterans advocacy organization, using her legal victory and public recognition to help other veterans navigate similar challenges with employers who failed to understand or respect their military experience. 1 year after her court testimony was vindicated, Rachel was invited to speak at the Denver Bar Association's annual conference about the intersection of military service, civilian employment, and legal advocacy. Her presentation included both the legal aspects of her case and the personal experience of having her truthful testimony dismissed as fantasy. The most important lesson from my experience, she told the assembled attorneys, is that truth doesn't become less true because it seems impossible to those who haven't lived it. Military service, particularly in combat situations, creates experiences that civilian society may struggle to understand or accept. She continued, as legal professionals, we have an obligation to investigate thoroughly rather than dismiss claims based on our preconceived notions about what's possible or credible. Sometimes the most extraordinary testimony turns out to be the most accurate. The audience, which included Judge Thornton and several of the attorneys who had initially been skeptical of her claims, listened with the respect due to someone whose experience had challenged their assumptions about credibility, heroism, and the intersection of military and civilian life. 2 years after her legal victory, Rachel married David Kim, the attorney who had believed in her case when others saw only fantasy. Their wedding was attended by Colonel Harrison, several of her former military colleagues, and jury members from her trial who had become friends and supporters of her advocacy work. During her wedding speech, Rachel reflected on how the experience of having her truth questioned and ultimately validated had shaped her understanding of service, integrity, and the importance of persistent advocacy for justice. David believed in my story when 12 jurors thought I was delusional, she said. That's the kind of faith that makes both good marriages and good legal representation possible. The couple established a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping veterans navigate employment discrimination and supporting military families affected by classified service that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Their work continued the mission that had begun with Rachel's lawsuit, ensuring that military service was respected and protected in civilian society. 5 years after her testimony was vindicated by presidential recognition, Rachel was invited to return to the same Denver courthouse to speak at a ceremony honoring veterans who had made significant contributions to civilian society. The event was held in the same courtroom where her credibility had been questioned and her service mocked. Judge Thornton, now preparing for retirement, introduced Rachel with obvious respect and pride in how the case had been resolved. Ms. Martinez taught this court important lessons about assumptions, credibility, and the extraordinary service provided by ordinary Americans in extraordinary circumstances. Rachel's speech in the courtroom, where she had been ridiculed, was gracious and educational rather than vindictive. She spoke about the importance of due process, the value of persistent advocacy, and the obligation of legal institutions to remain open to evidence that challenges initial assumptions. This courtroom heard my story when it sounded impossible and ultimately recognized it when evidence emerged to support my testimony, she concluded. That's exactly how our legal system is supposed to work. Not perfectly, but eventually, toward truth and justice. Have you ever told the truth and been dismissed as a fantasist? Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons, but with persistent integrity in the face of disbelief. Rachel Martinez proved that truth, no matter how extraordinary, will eventually be recognized when supported by evidence and unwavering character. From which part of the world are you watching this incredible journey from mockery to presidential recognition? If stories where persistence and truth overcome skepticism and prejudice inspire you, subscribe for more moments where heroes are revealed not in how they fight enemies, but in how they face doubt with dignity and integrity.